For more insights, we are now joined by Gregory Treverton. He's a professor emeritus at University of Southern California. He was also a former chair of the U.S. National Intelligence Council. Thank you so much for joining us again, Professor. The U.S. Launching additional strikes aimed at securing the Strait of Hormuz. Can that strategy, do you think, realistically work? And how far do you think Mr. Trump is prepared to go this time now that he says the ceasefire is over?
Yeah, I think that strategy probably can't work, right? He talks vaguely about taking over Karg Island, but that would be a major ground operation for which he has no stomach. So I think it's the idea that we can destroy enough Iranian assets to make them unable to close the strait. That seems to me to be kind of a pipe dream, and it does illustrate the dilemma the president's in. On the one hand, he doesn't want to admit that, in effect, we've lost this war. He can't do that for ego and political reasons. On the other hand, he also knows that the longer this goes on, the worse it is for the world economy and the U.S. economy. So he's really trapped, it seems to me, between a rock and a hard place, and indeed one of his own making, since this was his war of choice.
Professor, the Strait of Hormuz seems to be central to, the U.S. and Iran not really being able to maintain a ceasefire. Every time Iran targets shipping the strait, the U.S. strikes Iran, and then Tehran retaliates. So has Iran successfully transformed the strait into its strongest negotiating leverage? And if so, how it's going to shape the next phase of negotiation, assuming they continue to talk?
Well, absolutely. I think Iran has really understood, as we all did, that the best asset they had in this conflict, in any conflict, was the Straits of Hormuz. Now, that doesn't affect Israel much, so that's another wild card in the equation, but it does affect the rest of the world, including the United States. So they have understood that that is a really valuable asset that's almost impossible to take away with military means. And I think that really will color the next phase of the negotiations. It's hard to imagine that the straits wind up being open without some maybe joint Iranian-Omani control or tariff or environmental fee. It's hard to imagine an outcome that gets us back to the situation before the war, when the straits were open and it was an international waterway with no restrictions at all. So in that sense, almost any outcome of the war is going to be worse than what existed before it.
As you mentioned, valuable indeed, the Strait of Hormuz, but how long can Iran realistically retain its leverage over the strait if U.S. military pressure is sustained and as alternative shipping routes, as we understand, are beginning to emerge?
Absolutely. I think it is a wasting asset, but the wasting time is pretty long, right? Since the alternative routes, the alternative pipelines will take some time to put in place. So I think for the near term, the Iranians do hold most of the cards, and that makes it hard to imagine a solution happening very quickly. They do have this wonderful asset. We all knew they had it, except it seems to me President Trump didn't quite understand that. But with the rest of us did, and I think they will understand it is a kind of a waning asset, but for several years at least, it's bound to be, or they're bound to see it as a real source of revenue. And particularly now that the regime seems to have moved in a slightly less theocratic and more nationalistic direction, with the RGC, the Revolutionary Corps, really more in control. I think they're likely to see this as a national asset that they want to milk as far as they can.
Professor, if negotiators go back to the drawing board, do they need to hammer out explicit terms, you think, about controlling the strait then for the ceasefire to actually hold, to eventually find a lasting path to peace?
My suspicion is that we'll do it again, right? The intermediate outcome will be yet another ceasefire with yet another deadline to solve these problems. We've known that the issues were there and not much progress was made. The sides have always been very far apart on almost every issue, from the Straits to Iran's nuclear program. So my guess is the best outcome would be in the immediate future would be another agreement for a ceasefire and some continued talks with perhaps the straits remaining open in some way during that ceasefire. I think that's the best we can imagine at the moment. Imagining a long-term solution to this is very much harder because the parties really are very far apart between what the Iranians think they can force and what Donald Trump thinks he needs to call this a victory. That's an enormous gap, and it's hard to imagine that being bridged anytime very soon.
Yeah, I just want to look at the mediators as well. So you've got Qatar and Oman there. How much influence and leverage do they actually have? Or are they just seen as trusted channels for communication? And if it is the latter, then would it mean that these talks are less likely to succeed? I mean, this is just like a holding pattern kind of situation. And not to mention, Iran has also attacked Qatar and Oman's vessels. So really, how damaging is that going to be then to their credibility and their ability to remain neutral and impartial?
Yes, I think the best intermediaries we have, Pakistan, Oman, Qatar, but none of them are, they obviously have their own interest, and the Iranians have been shown a willingness to attack them if need be. So here we are having indirect talks through intermediaries that are themselves subject to attack. So it's not a very promising way to conduct a negotiation. And on the U.S. side, it's being done, well, I think more technical assistance has come in, but it's being done by basically real estate developers who have no diplomatic or international experience in negotiation. So it is hard to be promising about the negotiations since they continue to be conducted not directly, but through intermediaries with not much entry into the things that matter. As we say, the devil is in the details. And if we look at the nuclear agreement that got negotiated when I was in the government, it was very detailed, 150 pages with lots of experts. It seems to be a long way from that possibility still.
And Professor, the NATO summit just wrapping up in Ankara as we speak, where President Trump again criticized allies for not doing more on Iran. Could and should NATO member states step in to secure the Strait of Hormuz? I mean, after all, they rely on the Strait far more than the U.S. does.
I think that it's fair to ask them to step in. I mean, there's not a lot of capability. There is some. And if we could get an agreement that didn't put them in immediate harm's way, that didn't make them combatants, that didn't look like they were part of an American offensive, then I think, yeah, we could count on the Brits and others to help out. It was mainly a sort of a peacekeeping, patrolling operation. But that depends on getting the Iranians to agree that that's the nature of the straits and passage through it. We're still a ways away from that. Notice that the last attacks happened because the Iranians attacked the ships going through the route away from Iran, off Oman, which had been tried to be opened by the United States and others. So yes, I think the possibility is there, and particularly given that the NATO allies' interest in keeping some contact, some understanding with the president, that they would participate, I think, but it have to be in really a peacekeeping situation, not a war-making situation.
Okay, understood. Thank you very much, Professor Treverton, for joining us. Gregory Treverton, Professor Emeritus at University of Southern California and former chair of the U.S. National Intelligence Council.